What if I told you there were towns in America where the law had no power, where criminals ran everything, from the cops to the courts, from elections to entire economies? These weren't just crime hotspots. They were full-blown empires of corruption, ruled by gangsters, killers, and kingpins who made the rules and broke them without consequence. From Al Capone's iron grip on Cicero to the mob-infested streets of Hell's Kitchen, from the bloody gold rush chaos of Central City to the lawless brothels of Galveston. These weren't just places where crime thrived. They were places where crime was the law. A corrupt mining empire, a Wild West town ruled by guns and fear, a city so lawless the National Guard had to take it back. These are the 7 towns in America that were completely controlled by criminals, and once you hear their stories, you'll never look at history the same way again. Cicero, Illinois, Al Capone's stronghold. Cicero, Illinois, is one of the most infamous towns in American history, known for being under the complete control of organized crime, specifically Al Capone and his gang. Located just outside Chicago, Cicero became a safe haven for criminal activity during the Prohibition era. As Chicago authorities began cracking down on bootlegging and illegal enterprises, Capone saw the neighboring town as an opportunity to establish his base of operations without the same level of police interference. His move to Cicero in the early 1920s marked the beginning of a reign of terror and corruption that made the town a lawless haven for gangsters. By 1924, Capone had nearly total control over Cicero's government. Using a combination of bribes, intimidation, and violence, he ensured that local politicians, law enforcement officers, and city officials either worked for him or stayed out of his way. The town became filled with speakeasies, gambling halls, and brothels, all under the protection of the Capone organization. Those who opposed him often found themselves either beaten into submission or eliminated. Capone's power was so absolute that even law-abiding citizens had no choice but to turn a blind eye to the rampant crime around them. One of the most shocking displays of Capone's dominance came during the 1924 Cicero municipal elections. Determined to ensure that his hand-picked candidates won, Capone's men resorted to extreme measures, including voter intimidation, ballot stuffing, and outright violence. Rival politicians and their supporters were kidnapped, beaten, and in some cases, even murdered. The streets of Cicero became battlegrounds, with Capone's men openly attacking those who tried to vote against his interests. On Election Day, brutal clashes left several people dead, including an innocent bystander who was simply caught in the crossfire. Despite these atrocities, Capone's candidates won the election, cementing his grip on the town's leadership. With Cicero firmly under his control, Capone expanded his criminal empire. The town became a hub for illegal alcohol production and distribution during Prohibition, with shipments of liquor being moved across the country from Cicero's warehouses. Gambling and prostitution also flourished, generating millions of dollars in revenue for Capone's organization. The police force, instead of enforcing the law, acted as enforcers for the mob, protecting illegal operations and ensuring that no rival gangs could challenge Capone's authority. Those officers who refused to cooperate were swiftly dealt with, either through bribes or by force. Despite the rampant corruption, federal authorities struggled to make any real progress in taking down Capone's operations in Cicero. The combination of bribed officials and the sheer fear that Capone instilled in people made it nearly impossible for anyone to speak out against him. Journalists who attempted to expose the corruption were threatened, and witnesses were either bought off or eliminated before they could testify against the mob. This cycle of fear and violence ensured that Capone's empire remained nearly untouchable for years. However, Capone's control over Cicero and the greater Chicago area would eventually come to an end. Federal law enforcement, led by agents like Eliot Ness and the Untouchables, began to target Capone's financial records, recognizing that tax evasion could be the key to bringing him down. While the murders and illegal activities were difficult to prosecute due to witness intimidation, tax records provided a clear paper trail of Capone's illicit earnings. After years of investigation, Capone was finally arrested and convicted of tax evasion in 1931, leading to his imprisonment. Although Capone's personal reign ended with his incarceration, organized crime did not disappear from Cicero overnight. The infrastructure he had built continued to support criminal activities for years, with other gangsters stepping in to fill the power vacuum. Corruption remained a significant issue in the town well into the mid-20th century. Even after law enforcement made strides in cleaning up Cicero, its reputation as a mafia stronghold persisted. The town had been so deeply entrenched in organized crime that the effects of Capone's rule were felt long after he was gone. Cicero's history as a town controlled by criminals serves as a stark example of how corruption and organized crime can take over an entire community. With law enforcement compromised and public officials on the payroll of the mob, the town essentially became a lawless zone where criminals operated with impunity. While the days of Capone's rule are long over, Cicero remains an infamous chapter in the story of American organized crime. Phenix City, Alabama. The Sin City of the South Phenix City, Alabama, was once known as the most corrupt city in the United States, a place where organized crime, political corruption, and vice ruled without opposition. Located just across the Chattahoochee River from Columbus, Georgia, Phenix City became a haven for illegal gambling, prostitution, and violent crime, fueled in large part by its proximity to Fort Benning, a major U.S. Army base. Soldiers from the base frequently visited Phenix City, spending their paychecks on the town's illicit attractions, and local criminals quickly realized they could exploit this steady flow of money. Over the years, the city became almost entirely controlled by a network of corrupt politicians, law enforcement officers, and organized crime figures who ensured that Phenix City remained a lawless free-for-all. From the early 20th century onward, Phenix City was notorious for its open defiance of law and order. Illegal casinos operated in broad daylight, protected by police officers who were either bribed or directly involved in the gambling industry themselves. Prostitution rings flourished, and those who attempted to interfere with the city's criminal enterprises often met violent ends. The town became so infamous that soldiers stationed at Fort Benning were regularly warned to stay away. But the lure of gambling and nightlife was too strong to keep them from crossing the river. Local officials not only tolerated the crime, but actively encouraged it, knowing that it brought in enormous amounts of money. Those who attempted to challenge the system, including honest law enforcement officers and reformers, were swiftly intimidated, assaulted, or even murdered. The criminal grip on Phenix City reached its peak in the 1940s and 1950s, when the city was effectively ruled by a powerful crime syndicate. Political positions, including sheriff and district attorney, were often filled by individuals who were either criminals themselves or completely beholden to the mob. Rigged elections ensured that no reformers could gain power, and anyone who spoke out against the corruption was quickly silenced. The town's illegal gambling houses brought in millions of dollars, much of it from unsuspecting soldiers and out-of-town visitors who were cheated out of their money in rigged games. Meanwhile, prostitution and illegal liquor sales continued to thrive, making Phenix City a hub of vice, unlike anywhere else in the country. The turning point in Phenix City's history came in 1954 with the assassination of Albert Patterson, a local attorney who had recently been elected as Alabama's Attorney General. Patterson had campaigned on a platform of ending the city's corruption and cracking down on the crime syndicate that controlled Phenix City. His efforts made him a direct threat to the criminal empire, and on June 18, 1954, he was gunned down outside his law office. The murder shocked the nation and made it impossible for Alabama's state government to continue ignoring the rampant corruption in Phenix City. The brazen nature of the killing made it clear that the town's criminals had become so powerful that they felt untouchable, even going as far as murdering a soon-to-be attorney general in broad daylight. In response to the assassination, Alabama Governor Gordon Persons declared martial law in Phenix City, an unprecedented move that saw the Alabama National Guard sent in to take control of the town. Martial law remained in effect for several months as state authorities launched a massive crackdown on crime and corruption. National Guard troops raided illegal casinos, shut down brothels, and arrested numerous local officials who had been complicit in organized crime. The scale of the operation was unlike anything seen before in the U.S., with an entire city essentially placed under military occupation to restore law and order. Many of the town's most notorious criminals were arrested and prosecuted, and the deeply entrenched corruption that had ruled Phenix City for decades was finally broken. The aftermath of the crackdown saw a dramatic transformation in Phenix City. While it took years for the town to fully recover from its reputation as a crime haven, the efforts of law enforcement and reformers gradually turned Phenix City into a more law-abiding community. Many of the illegal gambling operations were permanently shut down, and the influence of organized crime significantly declined. However, the town's history as a lawless sin city remained a dark chapter that many residents preferred to forget. Phenix City's story serves as one of the most extreme examples of criminal control over an American town. For decades, the city was run more like a mafia enterprise than a legitimate municipality, with criminals dictating law enforcement policy, rigging elections, and using violence to maintain their grip on power. The fact that it took the intervention of the state government and the deployment of the National Guard to finally bring an end to the corruption speaks to just how deeply entrenched crime had become. While modern Phenix City has moved on from its lawless past, its history remains a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked corruption and organized crime. Central City, Colorado, lawless gold rush town. Central City, Colorado was one of the many towns that sprang up during the mid-19th century gold rush. But unlike some settlements that developed into respectable communities, Central City became a hotbed of crime, corruption, and lawlessness. Located in the Rocky Mountains, it was established in 1859 after a massive gold discovery in the region, which led to a flood of prospectors, fortune seekers, gamblers, and criminals. Like many boomtowns of the era, the sudden influx of people led to an absence of stable governance, allowing criminals to take control of nearly every aspect of daily life. As prospectors arrived in search of riches, saloons, brothels, and gambling halls quickly sprang up to cater to them. Central City became a place where disputes were settled with guns, and justice was often determined by whoever had the fastest draw. With no effective law enforcement, the town was ruled by violent gangs and powerful saloon owners who enforced their own brutal brand of justice. Murders, robberies, and violent brawls became a daily occurrence, and those who stood in the way of the criminal elite rarely lived long enough to regret it. The only law that existed was that of the vigilante groups that occasionally attempted to bring order to the chaos, but even they were often corrupt or self-serving. One of the defining characteristics of Central City's criminal rule was the dominance of organized gambling syndicates. Rigged card games and dishonest casinos ensured that most of the miners who struck gold never left town with their money. Many gamblers found themselves deeply in debt to the criminal underworld, and those who couldn't pay up often met violent ends. The few lawmen who attempted to enforce order were either quickly bribed or, if they refused, were eliminated by the powerful criminals who ran the town. Judges and local officials were often in on the schemes, making it nearly impossible for honest citizens to seek justice. Prostitution also became a major industry in Central City, with powerful madams controlling entire sections of the town. Women working in the brothels were often treated like property, with little chance of escape from the criminal enterprises that ran them. Many of these establishments were tied to the larger criminal syndicates that operated the gambling halls, ensuring that money continued to flow into the pockets of those in power. These vice industries were so profitable that even when mining production declined, Central City remained a major hub for illegal activity. The violence and lawlessness of Central City were legendary, with frequent shootouts in the streets and deadly conflicts between rival criminal factions. The town's remote location in the mountains made it difficult for territorial law enforcement to intervene, further emboldening criminals. Even after the gold rush boom slowed down, the criminal underworld maintained its grip on Central City, ensuring that it remained a dangerous place well into the late 19th century. Bounty hunters and outlaws continued to pass through the town, and it took years for legitimate governance to gain a foothold. Eventually, as mining production declined and settlers moved elsewhere, the town's criminal enterprises began to weaken. The arrival of more stable law enforcement and the decline of the gold industry led to the gradual dismantling of the corrupt power structures that had once ruled Central City. However, the town's reputation as a lawless frontier settlement remained for decades, and its history is still remembered as one of the most extreme cases of criminal control over a gold rush-era town. Today, Central City has transformed into a historical tourist destination, with remnants of its wild past preserved for visitors. Many of the old saloons and gambling halls have been restored, but the violence and corruption that once ruled the town are now just stories told in museums and guided tours. Despite its modern revival, Central City's history remains a cautionary tale of what happens when lawlessness and unchecked greed take over a community. Galveston, Texas. The Free State of Galveston. Galveston, Texas was once known as the Free State of Galveston, a nickname that reflected its lawless and crime-ridden past. From the late 19th century through the mid-20th century, the city was completely controlled by organized crime, corrupt politicians, and powerful business interests that allowed illegal gambling, bootlegging, and prostitution to flourish. Despite efforts by law enforcement to curb the city's criminal activities, Galveston operated almost as an independent entity where the rules of the rest of the country simply did not apply. The roots of Galveston's criminal empire began in the late 1800s when the city was a booming port town. Its strategic location on the Gulf of Mexico made it a prime spot for smuggling, and organized crime quickly took hold. By the early 1900s, Galveston had become the gambling capital of Texas, with dozens of illegal casinos operating openly. Local law enforcement and government officials were either bribed to look the other way or were directly involved in running these establishments. Attempts to crack down on gambling were met with resistance, as Galveston's economy had become dependent on the revenue generated by illegal activities. The criminal empire of Galveston reached its peak during Prohibition, when bootlegging became a major industry. Smugglers used the city's ports to bring in large shipments of alcohol from the Caribbean, and speakeasies flourished throughout the island. Gangsters controlled much of the city's economy, and those who attempted to oppose them were quickly silenced. Violence was common, but it was often masked behind a veneer of respectability, as many of the town's wealthiest and most influential residents were directly involved in the illicit trade. The rise of the Maceo crime syndicate in the 1920s and 1930s further cemented Galveston's reputation as a city controlled by criminals. The Maceo brothers, Sam and Rosario, ran the town's most luxurious casinos, including the famous Balinese Room, and maintained tight control over the city's illegal enterprises. They used their wealth to buy political influence, ensuring that any attempts to enforce the law were quickly shut down. Under their rule, Galveston became a playground for the rich and famous, attracting celebrities and high-profile visitors who came to enjoy the city's illegal gambling and nightlife. Despite its reputation, Galveston's criminal empire lasted far longer than similar operations in other cities. While places like Chicago and New York saw intense crackdowns on organized crime, Galveston managed to operate relatively undisturbed for decades. However, by the 1950s, the state of Texas began to take serious action against the city's criminal activities. The Texas Rangers launched a major crackdown, shutting down illegal casinos, raiding underground operations, and arresting key figures in the city's crime syndicates. The decline of the Maceo Empire marked the beginning of the end for Galveston's era as a crime-controlled city. In the years that followed, Galveston struggled to rebuild its economy without the revenue generated by organized crime. Many of its once thriving businesses closed, and the city entered a period of economic decline. While Galveston eventually reinvented itself as a tourist destination, its past as the Free State of Galveston remains a significant part of its history. Today, remnants of its criminal past can still be seen in the restored historic buildings and old casino sites that once housed the city's most notorious illegal operations. Tombstone, Arizona, the Wild West's criminal haven. Tombstone, Arizona, is one of the most legendary Wild West towns, known for its lawlessness, gunfights, and criminal control. During the late 19th century, Tombstone was a booming silver mining town that attracted thousands of prospectors, gamblers, outlaws, and opportunists. With immense wealth flowing through the town, crime flourished, and for many years Tombstone was controlled by gangs and corrupt officials who ensured that law and order remained secondary to their own interests. The most infamous criminal group in Tombstone was the Cochise County Cowboys, a loosely organized gang of cattle rustlers, stagecoach robbers, and gunfighters who operated with near impunity. Unlike the stereotypical outlaw gangs that hid from the law, the cowboys were so powerful that they effectively ran the town. Many of them were friendly with local law enforcement, and some were even elected to political office, allowing them to manipulate the legal system in their favor. Rivalries between different factions often resulted in bloodshed, with shootouts becoming a regular occurrence in the streets of Tombstone. One of the defining moments in Tombstone's history was the legendary gunfight at the OK Corral in 1881. The conflict between the lawman, Wyatt Earp, his brothers Virgil and Morgan, and their ally Doc Holliday, against members of the Cowboys symbolized the deep divide between those who wanted to establish law and order and those who thrived in the chaos of an outlaw town. The gunfight left 3 cowboys dead and turned Tombstone into a national sensation. However, rather than marking the end of criminal control, the aftermath of the shootout led to even more violence. Morgan Earp was later assassinated, and a campaign of revenge killings followed as Wyatt Earp led a personal crusade to eliminate those responsible. Despite efforts to bring order to the town, crime continued to flourish in Tombstone. Corruption was rampant, with law enforcement officials frequently accepting bribes from saloon owners, gamblers, and outlaws. The town's numerous brothels and gambling houses were operated by powerful criminal figures who ensured that any interference was met with deadly force. Stagecoach robberies were common in the surrounding areas, and Tombstone developed a reputation as one of the most dangerous places in the West. The eventual decline of Tombstone's criminal empire came not through law enforcement efforts, but through economic downturns. As the silver mines that had fueled the town's prosperity began to dry up, many of its residents moved on to more promising locations. With fewer people and less money to be made, the town's criminal enterprises started to collapse. By the early 20th century, Tombstone had transformed from a bustling outlaw haven into a quiet, mostly abandoned town. Today, Tombstone has been preserved as a historical landmark, attracting tourists fascinated by its Wild West past. The site of the OK Corral remains one of the most visited locations, and reenactments of the famous gunfight are regularly performed. While modern Tombstone is a peaceful tourist town, its history as one of America's most lawless and criminally controlled settlements is still an essential part of its identity. The legacy of the cowboys, the Earps, and the violent struggles for power in Tombstone serve as a reminder of the Wild West's chaotic and often brutal past. Butte, Montana, a copper king's corrupt empire. Butte, Montana, was once one of the wealthiest and most influential cities in the United States, thanks to its massive copper mining industry. However, beneath its prosperity lay a dark history of corruption, crime, and corporate control that effectively turned the city into a lawless stronghold. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Butte was ruled not by elected officials or law enforcement, but by powerful mining corporations, particularly the Anaconda Copper Mining Company, which controlled every aspect of life in the city. The company's influence over politics, labor, and law enforcement created an environment where crime thrived, and those who opposed the ruling powers faced intimidation, violence, or even death. The wealth generated by Butte's copper mines attracted thousands of workers, many of them immigrants seeking fortune and stability. However, these workers soon found themselves at the mercy of corrupt corporate bosses who controlled their wages, working conditions, and even housing. Labor unions attempted to fight back against the exploitation, but their efforts were often met with brutal retaliation. Union leaders and activists who spoke out against the Anaconda Company frequently disappeared under suspicious circumstances, were beaten by hired thugs, or were assassinated in broad daylight. Law enforcement was entirely under the company's control, ensuring that justice was never served for those who dared to challenge the system. Beyond corporate corruption, Butte became a center of organized crime, with gambling, prostitution, and illicit alcohol sales dominating the underground economy. During Prohibition, Butte was known as a smuggler's paradise, with speakeasies and illegal distilleries operating openly under the protection of the very officials who were supposed to shut them down. Bootlegging rings made millions of dollars supplying alcohol to the region, and rival criminal factions often fought violent battles over territory and control. Murders and bombings became common, with few arrests ever made, as local police officers were either bribed to ignore the crimes or actively participated in them. The Anaconda Company's influence extended far beyond the economy and criminal underworld. It also controlled the press, ensuring that negative stories about its operations were either buried or rewritten to paint a more favorable image. Journalists who attempted to expose the corruption were silenced through threats or direct violence. Elections in Butte were often rigged, with company-backed candidates securing victory through voter intimidation, ballot manipulation, and outright fraud. The city's residents, particularly the working class, had little say in their governance, as any opposition to the Anaconda-controlled system was swiftly crushed. Despite its lawless and corrupt nature, Butte remained a major economic hub for decades. However, as copper demand declined and the mines began to shut down, the Anaconda Company's grip on the city weakened. By the mid-20th century, labor unions had gained more power, and government oversight began to break the corporate stranglehold that had controlled Butte for so long. However, the city's history as a place where crime and corporate interests ruled over justice and democracy remains a significant part of its identity. Today, Butte is a much quieter town, but its past as a lawless mining stronghold continues to be remembered as a cautionary tale of unchecked corporate power and corruption. Hell's Kitchen, New York, mobsters' playground. Hell's Kitchen, a neighborhood on the west side of Manhattan, was one of the most notorious crime-ridden areas in American history. From the late 19th century through the 20th century, the neighborhood was a battleground for gang wars, mob control, and political corruption. Its reputation as a dangerous and lawless place was solidified by the dominance of violent street gangs and organized crime families, who controlled everything from labor unions to illegal gambling, drug trafficking, and extortion. The origins of Hell's Kitchen's crime problem can be traced back to the wave of Irish immigrants who settled in the neighborhood during the mid-19th century. Faced with poverty and discrimination, many young men turned to gang life as a means of survival. Early gangs like the Gophers and the Hudson Dusters ruled the streets with brutality, engaging in robbery, extortion, and violent clashes with rival groups. The New York Police Department was largely ineffective in stopping the bloodshed, as many officers were either too afraid to intervene or were on the payroll of the gangs themselves. Corruption was rampant, and politicians often used the gangs as muscle to secure votes and intimidate opponents during elections. As the 20th century progressed, Hell's Kitchen became a stronghold for organized crime, particularly the Irish mob. The Westies, one of the most infamous Irish-American gangs, controlled much of the neighborhood's underworld during the 1960s and 1970s. Led by ruthless criminals like Mickey Spillane and later James "Jimmy" Coonan, the Westies engaged in extortion, loan sharking, contract killings, and drug trafficking. The gang's reputation for violence was legendary, with members known for dismembering their victims and leaving body parts scattered around the city as a warning to others. The Westies were so feared that even the Italian mafia, which dominated most of New York's organized crime, chose to work with them rather than risk direct conflict. Beyond gang activity, Hell's Kitchen was also plagued by police corruption and political manipulation. Many local officials had close ties to the criminal underworld, ensuring that investigations into major crimes often went nowhere. The neighborhood's labor unions were controlled by the mob, making it impossible for legitimate businesses to operate without paying off gang leaders. Construction projects, trucking routes, and even film productions in New York had to go through the gang-controlled unions, ensuring that organized crime remained deeply embedded in the city's economy. The decline of Hell's Kitchen's criminal empire began in the late 1980s and early 1990s, when federal authorities launched aggressive investigations into organized crime. Key figures in the Westies were arrested and convicted, effectively dismantling the gang's power structure. At the same time, gentrification and real estate development transformed the neighborhood, driving out many of the criminal elements that had once thrived there. By the 2000s, Hell's Kitchen had undergone a complete transformation, with luxury apartments and upscale restaurants replacing the old gang hangouts and crime-infested tenements. Despite its modern, more polished appearance, Hell's Kitchen's past as a mob-controlled neighborhood remains a significant part of its identity. The stories of gang wars, police corruption, and organized crime syndicates continue to captivate historians and crime enthusiasts alike. While the days of the Westies and the Irish mob ruling the streets are long gone, Hell's Kitchen's history as one of the most dangerous and crime-ridden areas in New York City serves as a stark reminder of how deeply organized crime can infiltrate and control a community.